70 years of topsoil under his boots, and Lucas bet it all on a rusted-out Case IH that sounded like a washing machine full of gravel. It wasn't just a wager for 320 acres of prime bottomland. It was a death sentence for a proud man. But the sealed envelope changed everything. The grease under the 1,988 Case IH 1,680 didn't just coat Dean Gallagher's hands, it seemed to sink into his pores, staining the very architecture of his fingerprints. It smelled of sulfur, burnt belt rubber, and the slow decay of stagnant hydraulic fluid. Dean lay flat on his back in the dirt, the jagged gravel of the machine shed floor pressing into his shoulder blades through his sweat-soaked t-shirt. Mid-August heat in the valley didn't breathe. It sat on your chest like a wet wool blanket. He wrenched a half-inch socket against a seized bolt on the combine's starter motor, his knuckles white, his breath hissing out between clenched teeth. The bolt sheared off, just like that, flush with the cast-iron block. Dean didn't scream right away. He let his head fall back against the dirt, feeling the grit stick to the sweat on his neck. He closed his eyes. In the suffocating quiet of the tin-roofed shed, he could hear the relentless buzzing of horseflies and the distant mocking rumble of a neighbor's brand-new John Deere S790 rolling across the ridge. $1 million piece of machinery, climate-controlled, guided by satellites. And here Dean was, fighting a 30-year-old rusted corpse of a machine that had served as a high-rise apartment for field mice since 2014. He threw the wrench. It clanged sharply against the corrugated tin wall, leaving a fresh dent before clattering to the floor. "Son of a bitch," he whispered, the sound entirely hollow in the empty shed. He dragged himself out from under the chassis, wiping his hands on a shop rag that was already more oil than cotton. As he stood, his left knee popped loudly, a souvenir from a dirt bike wreck in his 20s that now served as a daily reminder of his impending middle age. He looked at the combine. The red paint had long since surrendered to the sun, fading to a chalky, oxidized pink. The tires were dry-rotted, laced with deep, spiderweb cracks. The header was detached, sitting on a rusted trailer, its reel tines bent like broken fingers. This was his chariot. This was the vessel of his supposed salvation. Dean walked over to the workbench, kicking aside an empty plastic bucket, and grabbed a lukewarm bottle of water. He drank half of it in 3 gulps, the water tasting faintly of plastic and dust. He stared through the grimy window of the shed toward the farmhouse up on the hill. His grandfather, Lucas, was likely sitting on the porch right now, drinking black coffee despite the 90-degree heat, watching the shed. Lucas didn't miss anything. The old man was 78, built like a fence post, and possessed a heart that Dean had long assumed was made of petrified wood. The memory of the lawyer's office 3 weeks ago still tasted like ash in Dean's mouth. It had been a Tuesday. Harlan, the estate lawyer, had looked profoundly uncomfortable sitting behind his mahogany desk, sweating through his seersucker suit. Lucas had sat perfectly still, his calloused hands resting on the knob of his cane. "The lower basin," Lucas had said, his voice like dry leaves dragging across concrete. 320 acres, the only soil on this whole damn farm that doesn't require a prayer to yield. "I know what the basin is, Grandpa," Dean had replied, shifting in his leather chair. He had been desperate. The bank was threatening foreclosure on Dean's own mortared-up operation across the county line. 3 years of drought and a fluctuating commodities market had bled him out. He had come to Lucas for a bridge loan. Instead, Lucas offered a wager. "You want the basin?" Lucas said, not a question. "You want to sell it. Break it up. Subdivide it to those developers from the city who want to build ranchettes for rich folks who want to pretend they know how to ride horses." "I want to save my own neck, Lucas. I'm drowning." Dean dropped the familial title. When it came to money, they weren't family. They were competing entities. "You're drowning because you farm from an iPad, Dean," the old man spat, his pale blue eyes narrowing. "You bought $500,000 of equipment you didn't own on credit you couldn't afford, to plant crops you didn't understand. You don't know the dirt. You know the spreadsheets." Dean's jaw tightened. "I didn't come here for a lecture on modern agriculture." "No, you came here for a bailout." Lucas leaned forward, resting his weight on the cane. "I'm not giving you a dime, but I'll give you the deed to the lower basin, free and clear. All 320 acres, worth $2 million on the open market today." Dean had frozen. What's the catch? Harlan slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. The catch, Lucas said, is that you harvest the winter wheat in the basin yourself. No hired hands, no custom crews, no satellite-guided, air-conditioned luxury liners. You cut it, you bin it, and you deliver it to the elevator. And you do it using the old case out in the shed. Dean stared at him. Sure, it was a joke, but Lucas never joked. The 1,680? It hasn't run in 10 years. The engine is seized. The auger is rusted through. It's scrap metal, Lucas. Then you better get a wrench, boy, Lucas said softly. If you bring the harvest in with that machine, before the autumn rains take the crop, Harlan here files the deed in your name. You can sell it, keep it, burn it. I won't care. I'll be dead soon anyway. But if you fail, if you hire someone, if you bring in your own rigs, or if that wheat rots in the field because you couldn't keep a real machine running, the land goes to a corporate trust. You get nothing. Not a single acre. It was a trap. Dean knew it was a trap. The old man wanted to watch him break. Lucas hated Dean's father. He hated Dean's modern methods. And he hated the fact that the bloodline was ending with a man who couldn't repair a carburetor without watching a YouTube tutorial. But Dean had signed it. His pride, toxic and volatile, had flared up, eclipsing his common sense. Now, standing in the sweltering shed with a sheared starter bolt and a bloody knuckle, Dean realized exactly how thoroughly he had been played. The old man wasn't testing him. He was executing him. Dean picked up the heavy iron wrench from the floor. He didn't want the land to farm it. He wanted to sell it, take the cash, pay off his debts, and move far away from the suffocating dust of this valley. He wanted to wipe the smug, calcified look off Lucas's face. He walked back to the combine, grabbed a drill and an extractor bit. Fine, Dean muttered to the empty shed, the bitterness coating his tongue like copper. Let's bleed. It took 9 days of brutal, knuckle-busting labor to get the case 1,680 to turn over. When it finally did, it wasn't a triumphant roar. It was a violent, asthmatic shudder that shook the entire corrugated shed. A thick plume of blue-black diesel smoke belched from the exhaust stack, smelling violently of sulfur and burning mouse nests. Dean sat in the cab, the seat cushions completely stripped of their upholstery, leaving only yellow, crumbling foam that stuck to his sweat-drenched jeans. The steering wheel was sticky. The air conditioning was entirely dead, and the fan only succeeded in blowing hot, dust-laden air directly into his face. The noise was deafening, a chaotic clatter of loose belts, ungreased bearings, and an engine that sounded like it was constantly clearing its throat. He engaged the separator. The massive machinery behind him groaned into motion. The vibration rattled Dean's teeth. He pulled the hydrostat lever forward, and the massive, clumsy beast lurched out of the shed, blinding into the brutal afternoon sun. The lower basin was a sprawling ocean of amber, 320 acres of winter wheat, heavy with grain, swaying gently in the hot wind. It was a beautiful sight to anyone who didn't have to cut it. To Dean, it looked like a prison sentence. He lowered the header. The cutter bar engaged with a metallic shriek that made him wince. He drove into the first swath. The reel spun, pulling the stalks into the auger. The thresher swallowed the wheat, tearing the grain from the chaff. A cloud of fine yellow dust immediately plumed up around the cab, sticking to the grease on the windshield and turning the glass into a hazy, opaque film. Dean had to lean out the open side window just to see the edge of the crop line, coughing as the chaff filled his lungs. For the first 2 hours, it held together. Dean settled into a miserable rhythm. The heat inside the glass box of the cab climbed past 110 degrees. Sweat dripped from his nose, stinging his eyes. His back ached intensely from the lack of suspension in the seat. He was monitoring a dozen different dials, most of which had broken glass faces, listening desperately to the agonizing mechanical symphony behind him for any sign of catastrophic failure. At 3 o'clock, the combine simply stopped swallowing. A high-pitched squeal ripped through the air, followed by a violent thud that shook the chassis, and the distinct, acrid stench of burning rubber filled the cab. Dean slammed the hydrostat into neutral and killed the separator. The engine idled roughly. He sat there for a long moment, gripping the sticky steering wheel. He didn't swear. He just closed his eyes, feeling the heavy, rhythmic thumping of a stress headache forming at the base of his skull. He climbed down the ladder. The heat coming off the engine block hit him like an open oven door. He walked around to the side panel and unlatched it. The main drive belt had snapped, but it hadn't just snapped. It had melted into a tangled, shredded nest of rubber and Kevlar wire, wrapping itself tightly around the primary pulley. Dean stared at it. The sheer physical effort required to cut that melted rubber away, pry the pulley loose, drive 40 miles to the nearest implement dealer, pay an exorbitant markup for a legacy part, and then thread a new belt back onto this rusted nightmare, was suddenly too much. He felt a deep, hollow exhaustion, not just in his muscles, but in his marrow. What was the point? The bank was going to take his farm anyway. Why die of heat stroke in a field for a grandfather who viewed him with active contempt? Dean kicked the massive front tire of the combine. The thick rubber barely yielded, but the impact sent a jarring pain up his leg. He kicked it again. He picked up a heavy crescent wrench from the side toolbox and hurled it as hard as he could at the sheet metal of the side panel. It hit with a loud clang, leaving a deep, jagged dent before bouncing into the wheat stubble. "Keep it," Dean screamed at the empty field, his voice cracking, ragged and pathetic. "Keep the damn land." He stood there, chest heaving, sweat pouring down his face, cutting tracks through the thick layer of dirt and chaff on his skin. He looked up toward the hill. The farmhouse was a distant white speck against the vast, bruised blue of the sky. He knew Lucas was watching. He knew the old man had binoculars sitting on the porch rail. Lucas was probably pouring his second cup of coffee right now, a thin, satisfied smile playing on his lips, waiting for Dean to start walking up the long driveway to admit defeat. Dean's breathing slowed. The anger didn't dissipate. It sharpened, cooling into a hard, dense wedge in his chest. It wasn't about the money anymore. It wasn't about the debt. It was about the utter refusal to give Lucas Gallagher the satisfaction of being right. Dean walked over, retrieved the wrench from the stubble, and walked back to the tangled mess of the pulley. He pulled a pocket knife from his jeans, opened the blade, and started hacking at the melted rubber. By the time he got the new belt on, the sun was dropping below the horizon, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and violet. His hands were bleeding in 3 different places, the cuts instantly packed with grease and dirt. Every muscle in his upper body felt like it had been beaten with a wooden mallet. He climbed back into the cab, turned on the halogen work lights. Only 2 of the 4 actually illuminated, casting harsh, uneven shadows across the crop, and pushed the throttle forward. He cut wheat until 3 in the morning, driven entirely by a toxic, burning spite. By day 4, the fatigue had fundamentally altered Dean's perception of reality. He was running on 3 hours of sleep a night, surviving on gas station caffeine pills that made his heart flutter erratically and lukewarm water from a plastic jug. The world outside the cab had reduced itself to a hypnotic, endless tunnel of amber stalks falling under the spinning reel. He had cut maybe 200 acres. The grain tank had been emptied into the grain cart a dozen times. The old case was bleeding oil from a cracked gasket, required Dean to stop every 4 hours and pour in thick, black 5W40 just to keep the engine from seizing. The machine was quite literally consuming itself to get the job done, and Dean felt a strange, morbid kinship with it. Then, the barometer plummeted. Dean felt it in his bad knee before he saw it in the sky. A deep, aching throb settled into his joint. He looked out the grimy window toward the west. The horizon wasn't blue anymore. It was the color of a fresh bruise, a dark, turbulent purple, stacked high into the stratosphere. The air pressure dropped, and the wind shifted. It stopped blowing the dry, hot air from the south and began pulling cold, heavy air from the west. It smelled like ozone, wet asphalt, and impending violence. A severe thunderstorm was moving across the plains. Dean reached for his phone, his thumb leaving a greasy smear on the screen as he pulled up the radar. A massive red and yellow cell was barreling directly toward the valley. He had maybe 6 hours. If it rained a hard, driving Midwestern rain, the remaining 120 acres of wheat would lodge. It would be beaten flat against the mud. The old combine didn't have the power or the pickup reel to lift flattened wheat. The crop would rot in the field, and the bet would be lost. "No," Dean whispered, his voice hoarse from the dust. "Not now." He shoved the hydrostat lever forward, pushing the combine past its recommended ground speed. The engine roared in protest. the RPMs dropping dangerously low as the thresher struggled to process the sheer volume of material being forced into its throat. The entire machine vibrated violently, a low, terrifying thrum that Dean felt in his sternum. Night fell rapidly, not from the setting sun, but from the massive anvil cloud blotting out the sky. Lightning flickered inside the storm clouds, illuminating the rolling belly of the storm in flashes of cold blue light. The halogen lights on the combine began to flicker. The alternator was failing. Dean gripped the wheel, his knuckles white. "Hold together, you piece of junk. Just hold together." At 10 p.m., the wind was howling, tearing the chaff from the exhaust and whipping it across the windshield. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees. The first fat, heavy drops of rain began to splatter against the glass, leaving clean streaks in the dust. Suddenly, a loud, agonizing bang echoed from the belly of the machine, followed by a terrifying grinding noise. The engine bogged down instantly, choking on itself. A red warning light illuminated on the dash. Rotor plugged. Dean slammed the clutch, killing the power before the belts could snap. Silence fell over the cab, save for the wind howling through the cracks in the doors and the erratic spatter of rain. He had hit a wet patch of weeds, and a massive dense slug of green matter had completely jammed the rotor, the massive spinning cylinder that threshed the grain. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in Dean's chest. A plugged rotor wasn't a broken belt. It was a death sentence for a harvest night. Unplugging it required physically climbing into the belly of the machine, in the dark, and prying the compacted mass of weeds and wheat out by hand and with a pry bar. It usually took hours. Hours he didn't have. He looked at the radar on his phone. The leading edge of the heavy rain was less than an hour away. He grabbed his flashlight from the dash, clicked it on, and shoved open the cab door. The wind nearly tore it off its hinges. The cold air felt shocking against his feverish skin. He climbed down the ladder, his boots slipping on the metal rungs. He unlatched the heavy side shield that exposed the rotor cage. He shone the flashlight inside. It was a nightmare. A solid, concrete-like mass of green ragweed and wet wheat straw was wedged tightly between the rotor rasp bars and the concaves. Dean swore violently into the wind. He ran around to the toolbox bolted behind the rear tire, throwing open the heavy metal lid to find the long, steel pry bar. He dug through the rusty chains, spare bolts, and grease guns, his hands frantic. As he pulled the heavy steel bar free, something caught the beam of his flashlight. Taped to the underside of the toolbox lid, hidden entirely from view unless you were digging at the very bottom, was a heavy manila envelope. It was stained with oil around the edges, secured with a strip of silver duct tape that had yellowed with age. Written on the front, in thick black marker, in handwriting Dean immediately recognized as Lucas's sharp, jagged scrawl. "Open when the rotor chokes." Dean stared at it. The wind whipped his hair across his eyes. Lightning cracked overhead, followed 3 seconds later by a boom of thunder that shook the ground. His grandfather had known. The old man knew this exact machine, knew its flaws, knew the fields, and knew that pushed to the limit, the rotor would plug. He had planted this here. When? A week ago? 10 years ago? Dean felt a surge of pure, unadulterated hatred. This wasn't a bet. It was a sick, choreographed psychological game. Lucas was pulling the strings from his porch, playing Dean like a puppet. Dean reached up and violently ripped the envelope down. The tape tore with a loud screech. He held the thick package in his hand, feeling the weight of it. He wanted to open it. The curiosity burned in the back of his throat. But then he looked at the sky. The rain was picking up, the drops hitting the tin panels of the combine with a staccato rhythm. If he stood here reading the old man's twisted gloating, the crop would drown. Lucas wanted him to stop. Lucas wanted him to break down, read whatever manifesto or insult was in the envelope, and give up. "Go to hell," Dean snarled. He shoved the sealed envelope deep into the front pocket of his heavy denim jacket, grabbed the heavy steel pry bar, and marched back to the side of the combine. He climbed up onto the rear axle, wedging his shoulder against the dirty sheet metal. He jammed the flat end of the pry bar into the solid mass of weeds, his forearms straining, muscles screaming in protest. He threw his entire body weight against the bar. It didn't budge. Dean adjusted his grip. Rain ran down his neck, mixing with the grease on his collar. He thought of the bank. He thought of the smug developers. He thought of Lucas's cold blue eyes. He roared, a feral, ugly sound, and threw his weight against the iron bar again. Something gave. A small chunk of the weed mass broke free. Dean didn't stop. For 45 minutes, in the driving wind and the erratic flash of lightning, he fought the machine hand to hand. He tore at the sharp straw with his bare hands, the coarse stalks slicing into his cuticles, drawing fresh blood that made his grip slick. He jammed the bar, levered it, cursed, and dug. His back felt like it was on fire. His vision swam with exhaustion. Finally, with a loud groan, the main mass dislodged, falling into the grain pan below. Dean collapsed backward onto the wet dirt, the heavy steel bar dropping from his hands. He lay there, gasping for air, the rain falling directly into his open eyes. His chest heaved. He was covered head to toe in black grease, wet chaff, and his own blood. He pressed a hand to his jacket pocket. The envelope was still there, stiff and solid, beneath the wet denim. He dragged himself up. The real storm was minutes away. He climbed back into the cab, shivering uncontrollably as the wet clothes clung to his skin. He engaged the battery, prayed to a god he hadn't spoken to in years, and turned the key. The engine coughed, sputtered, and roared to life. Dean slammed the separator lever forward. The empty rotor spun freely, a beautiful loud hum that drowned out the thunder. He grabbed the hydrostat, pushed it forward, and drove back into the wheat just as the sky ripped completely open. He had to beat the flood. He had to finish. And when he did, he was going to march up to that farmhouse, throw the signed deed on the kitchen table, and finally open the old man's letter. The rain didn't fall. It collapsed. Within minutes of Dean re-engaging the separator, the sky emptied itself over the lower basin in a violent, driving deluge. The combine's single operational windshield wiper tore loose on its second pass, leaving a jagged strip of rubber flapping uselessly against the glass. The dust on the windshield instantly turned into a thick, gray paste. Dean couldn't see the crop line. He couldn't see the horizon. He could barely see the front of the header. He rolled the side window down, flinching as the freezing rain lashed against his face and neck. The water mixed with the thick layer of grease and chaff on his skin, running down his collar in icy, gritty streams. He had 40 acres left, 40 acres of winter wheat that was rapidly absorbing water, growing heavier by the second. The wind was flattening the stalks against the earth, creating a tangled, muddy mat. Dean dropped the header practically to the dirt. The steel skid plates dragged through the mud with a violent, shuddering vibration that traveled up the steering column and rattled his shoulder joints. The cutter bar shrieked, slicing through wet straw and occasionally striking a hidden rock, sending a terrifying metal-on-metal clack echoing through the thresher. "Chew it," Dean barked at the machine, his voice raw. "Just chew it, you bastard." The 1,680 was dying. Dean could hear it in the pitch of the diesel engine. The RPMs were lugging dangerously low, the motor groaning under the sheer wet mass of the crop being forced through the concaves. The belt slipped, squealing in protest as the moisture coated the pulleys. The smell of burning rubber and overheated hydraulic fluid permeated the cab, strong enough to make Dean gag. But he didn't lift his foot off the throttle. The ground beneath him was turning into a swamp. The deep, heavy clay of the basin, usually its greatest asset during a drought, now transformed into a slick, adhesive paste. The massive, dry-rotted front tires spun, losing traction, sliding sideways in the muck before the deep lugs finally found purchase, jerking the massive machine forward. Every time the grain tank filled, the alarm would sound a shrill electrical bleat that pierced Dean's stress headache like a hot needle. He would slam the hydrostat into neutral, leave the separator running so it wouldn't jam with wet straw, and limp the combine over to the gravel access road where he had parked the rented semi-truck. Swinging the auger out was an agonizing process. The hydraulic pump was failing, whining like a dying dog as it slowly extended the heavy metal tube over the truck's trailer. The wet grain didn't flow. It clumped and shoved its way out of the spout, a heavy, sodden mass of survival. By 3 a.m, the rain had settled into a steady, freezing drizzle. The temperature in the cab, devoid of a heater, hovered in the low 40s. Dean was violently shivering. His teeth clicked together so hard his jaw ached. The knuckles on his hands were split, oozing sluggish cold blood that he kept wiping thoughtlessly onto his denim jeans. He was running on adrenaline and pure, unadulterated spite. He imagined Lucas sitting in his dry, warm house, listening to the rain, confidently drafting the paperwork to transfer the land to a corporate trust. The thought acted like lighter fluid on the dying embers of Dean's energy. 30 acres, 20 acres, 10. At 4:15 a.m., the combine hit a deep rut filled with standing water. The front left tire sank up to the rim. The machine lurched violently, throwing Dean against the steering wheel. The engine bogged down, a heavy, choking sound, and then, with a final pathetic hiss of steam from the radiator, it died. The sudden silence in the cab was deafening, broken only by the patter of rain on the tin roof. Dean sat frozen. He didn't breathe. He stared out the open window. The header was empty. The reel was still. He looked to his right. The field was a sea of ragged, muddy stubble. He looked in the rearview mirror. The grain tank was empty, having offloaded the final bushel into the semi 20 minutes prior. It was done. The basin was cut. Dean turned the key. Nothing happened. The battery was completely drained, the alternator having given up hours ago. The case, 1,680, had delivered its final harvest, and it had died exactly where it stood. Dean didn't celebrate. He didn't feel a rush of triumph. He felt a profound, hollow sickness in his stomach. His body, realizing the war was over, immediately began to shut down. His bad knee throbbed with a sickening rhythm. His back was locked into a rigid arc of pain. He forced his fingers to uncurl from the steering wheel. They were cramped into claws. He pushed the heavy cab door open and practically fell out of the machine, his boots landing deep in the mud. He leaned against the massive rear tire, the cold, wet rubber grounding him, preventing his trembling legs from giving out. He stood there in the dark, the rain washing the worst of the blood and grease from his hands. He looked toward the farmhouse up on the hill. A single yellow light was burning in the kitchen window. Dean reached into his soaked jacket pocket. The thick manila envelope was still there, heavy and ruined by the rain, the edges peeling apart. He began to walk. The walk up the half-mile gravel driveway took 30 minutes. Dean dragged his boots, each one caked in 5 pounds of clay. Dawn was just beginning to break, a bruised, pale gray light bleeding over the eastern ridge. He reached the back porch of the farmhouse. He didn't bother scraping his boots. He grabbed the handle of the screen door, listening to the rusted hinges whine, and shoved his way into the kitchen. The room smelled intensely of stale Folgers coffee, old linoleum, and bacon grease. It was a smell Dean had known since childhood, a smell that had always made him feel small. Lucas sat at the Formica table. He wore a faded flannel shirt, his suspenders pulled tight over his thin shoulders. He had a mug of black coffee in his hand. He didn't look surprised to see Dean. He just looked ancient. Dean walked to the table, leaving a trail of muddy water, stray wheat chaff, and grease on the pristine floor. He reached into his back pocket, pulled out the crumpled, wet weigh tickets from the semi-truck, and tossed them down. They landed next to the sugar bowl with a soft smack. 320 acres, Dean rasped. His voice was completely shot, cut, binned, and loaded. The truck is sitting on the gravel. I'll drive it to the elevator at 8. Lucas looked at the tickets. He slowly lifted his eyes, taking in the bruised face, the split knuckles, and the soaked, ruined clothes. The combine? Lucas asked, his voice steady. Dead in the mud, Dean said, his jaw tight. Threw a rod or seized the block. It did what you asked. Call Harlan. File the deed. Lucas took a slow sip of his coffee. You unplugged the rotor. I did. By hand. In the storm. Yes. Lucas nodded. Sit down, Dean. You look like a corpse. I want my land. Sit, Lucas commanded, a flash of iron returning to his voice. Dean's legs gave out before his pride could argue. He collapsed into a wooden dining chair, wincing as his spine hit the hard backrest. Lucas pushed a clean ceramic mug across the table and poured it full of scalding black coffee from a glass percolator. Dean ignored it. He reached into his wet jacket, pulled out the ruined manila envelope, and threw it onto the table between them. The silver duct tape peeled off in dirty strips. You left this under the toolbox lid, Dean spat, his voice laced with venom. A little motivational reading, some insults to keep me going while I bled all over your scrap metal. For the first time in Dean's life, he saw his grandfather's hands tremble. The old man touched the wet paper with a calloused finger. I left it there 4 days ago, Lucas said quietly. When you went into town for caffeine pills. What is it? A contract stating I have to smile while you screw me over? Open it. Dean sneered. He hooked his thumb under the flap and tore it open. The paper was mushy, but the contents were protected inside a plastic Ziploc bag. Inside was a faded Polaroid photograph and a piece of heavy stationery covered in Lucas's sharp, jagged scrawl. Dean slid the photograph out first. It was taken at night, illuminated by a harsh camera flash. It showed a man standing by the massive rear tire of a Case 1680 Combine. The man was covered head to toe in wet, black grease. He held a heavy steel pry bar. He looked exhausted, feral, and utterly beaten. It wasn't Dean. Dean stared at the face beneath the grease. It was Lucas. The date, stamped in the white margin, read, AUG 141988. Dean's brow furrowed. He looked up at the old man. Lucas didn't speak. He just nodded toward the letter. Dean unfolded the cream-colored paper. Dan, if you are reading this, the rotor choked. You hit the wet patch at the bottom of the basin. You didn't quit. Otherwise, you never would have dug deep enough in the toolbox to find this. In August of 1988, the bank was foreclosing on this farm. Interest rates were at 18%. I bought that case, 1,680, on credit I couldn't afford. On the last night, the storm came early. The rotor plugged. I sat in the mud and cried. I was going to lose everything. I hated the dirt. I wanted to let it rot. But the dirt doesn't care if you're tired, Dean. The rain doesn't care if you're smart. Spreadsheets and iPads make you think you have control. You don't. You only keep what you are willing to bleed for. I didn't bet against you. I forced you to touch the iron. I forced you to feel the fear of the mud, because you've been farming on a screen, and when the screen breaks, you quit. You didn't quit tonight. You dug the rot out with your bare hands. Behind this letter is the deed to the lower basin. Sell it, pay your debts, run back to your air-conditioned tractors if you want. But also, behind this letter is my will. I have stage 4 pancreatic cancer. I have 3 months left. When I am gone, the remaining 1,200 acres belong to you, not a corporate trust. You. Don't sell it to the suits, Dean. Bleed for it. It's the only thing that lasts. Lucas. Dean stopped reading. The silence in the kitchen was absolute, save for the ticking stove clock. He looked at the bottom of the plastic bag. The deed and the legally notarized will sat, folded neatly. Dean felt the air leave his lungs. The spite and toxic hatred that had fueled him for 10 days evaporated, leaving behind a crushing weight. He looked across the table. Lucas was watching him. The rigid posture had softened. He looked incredibly fragile. Dean looked down at his own hands. They were covered in the same black grease, the same dried blood, the same mud as his grandfather's hands in the photograph. They weren't competing entities anymore. They were the same man, separated only by 36 years and a sheet of rusted metal. Dean slowly folded the letter. He set it down. Neither of them were men built for apologies. Instead, Dean reached forward, wrapped his battered, filthy hands around the clean white mug, and took a drink of the black coffee. It tasted like ash, diesel smoke, and survival. He swallowed, looking his grandfather dead in the eye. I'm not selling the basin, Dean said quietly, his voice cracking, and I'm not selling the valley. Lucas held his gaze for a long moment. Then the old man's lips twitched, forming the smallest ghost of a smile. Good, Lucas said softly. Now go take a shower. You smell like a wet dog. Dean didn't smile back, but the tightness in his chest finally broke. He sat in the quiet kitchen, listening to the rain start up again against the glass, feeling the undeniable weight of the dirt beneath his boots. If Dean's brutal fight through the storm and mud struck a chord with you, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more grounded, hard-hitting stories. Sometimes the greatest lessons aren't spoken. They're buried in the dirt and the grease of the work itself. What did you think of Lucas's harsh method of teaching his grandson? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Please share this video with someone who knows the true value of calloused hands.